What's good, everybody? Welcome to the Big Nate Review. It's your boy, Big Nate, and today, once again, we have a dope-ass discussion to talk about. Today, we are talking about Guillermo Del Toro's upcoming film, Frankenstein. So I saw this because it was first published we got a first look published by Vanity Fair of the upcoming film, and the frame that Vanity Fair published looked super intriguing. And just in general, Frankenstein is a book that I thoroughly enjoyed when I read it in terms of just the themes and the story and just everything that goes behind it. I thought was super fascinating, and the fact that we have Guillermo del Toro plus Frankenstein, I think actually has a ton of potential. And this is actually, I would say, like the most excited I've been for a movie, and particularly a literary movie, in a long time. So I wanted to take this, talk a little bit about the upcoming film, and also just talk about my thoughts of Frankenstein, and also what I think this film would need to do, like what I want to see to make a good Frankenstein film. So just a little bit of details about the upcoming film. It's going to be, I think it's produced, but it will be released on Netflix. Victor Frankenstein is going to be played by Oscar Isaac, and Frankenstein's monster is going to be played by someone named Jacob Eldori. Honestly, I'm not super familiar with either of these. I've heard of Oscar Isaac before, and then the funny thing about Jacob Eldori is I just like Googled him to see if I recognized him, which I didn't. Though to be fair, I don't watch many movies, but he does seem a little like kind of like pretty boy to be playing Frankenstein's monster, who's supposed to be like this grotesque, hideous figure. So, I'm kind of curious how that plays out, but I'm sure Guillermo del Toro sort of has a master plan. Also, full disclosure, I haven't seen too much by Guillermo. Like I've seen Pan's Labyrinth, which was fantastic, and Crimson Peak, which I also remember really liking. And I think at least just based off those two, I do think Guillermo del Toro, also because he's mentioned the fact that Frankenstein is almost like his dream project. Like I think he's been wanting to make this for years, but that plus like what I have seen of his films, I actually think there's tons of potential for a really great depiction, adaptation of the book here. And speaking of the book, it probably makes sense just to give a little sort of synopsis of what Frankenstein, the book, is actually about. And just again, briefly, what happens is there's a man, Victor Frankenstein, who ultimately, and this is one of the things I loved about the book, was in this sort of mystical but also scientific fashion, he ends up being able to create life, being able to animate the inanimate, right? And he does this through all sorts of crazy means, like he's going through graveyards and doing these experiments, and he's super into occult philosophy. But again, one of the things I love about it is the mystical aspect of it, where it's like he, even Frankenstein himself, poses the central question: from whence does life emerge? He essentially dedicates his life, almost driving himself mad. He becomes obsessed with this question of discovering the principle of life, and eventually he discovers it, and through that uses it to create his creation, which ends up being what the book calls the daemon, like Frankenstein's daemon, which is like this creature, and we'll get into all that. But it was essentially him trying to create a human, but it ends up being this disfigured, deformed beast, which is Frankenstein, although there's more to that than meets the eye. But and essentially, so the rest of the book is more or less Frankenstein's daemon haunting Frankenstein in various ways, which I won't get into details about, but that's essentially the story. Now, there's a few things that I think a successful Frankenstein movie will need to pull off, and these I think are things that Guillermo del Toro can absolutely do. So the first element is the depiction of nature in the natural world, and that, I mean, to the very core of this book, this is essentially Victor Frankenstein trying to surpass nature, or the laws, or what is humane and what ought to be permitted under the laws of nature. And just throughout the book, he is himself, in fact, he goes down this sort of mystical scientific route. There's a particular scene where like he sees basically a tree get struck down by lightning, and the fact that there's this tremendous tree which just in the snap of the finger could just get blasted to rags. He was just deeply fascinated by that. And then, I won't get into all that, but that leads him down this whole occult stuff. But just in general, it is in many ways Victor Frankenstein going up against, almost making a sin transgression against nature. And also, this book takes place throughout in the physical environment. It took place partly because Mary Shelley herself was traveling through the Alps and through the Rhine and all this stuff, which features prominently in the book. But in the book itself, there are tons of actual just descriptions of the landscape and the scenery. And I think what I would like to see is almost that sense of cosmic horror that comes from nature. I want it to be beautiful, but also terrifying in its vastness, right? Nature as an entity is itself definitely a key theme of this book. But along with that, also, it's sort of like this mirror of the psychology of both Victor Frankenstein and his demon, who both whom both find inspiration from. And from what I've seen of Guillermo del Toro, it's been a long time since I've seen either of those movies, but particularly with Crimson Peak, I remember that being a very gothic but also very cinematically beautiful. Like some of those shots and the frames were just, really stunning to the point where it still kind of sticks. That's what I remember most about Crimson Peak and Pan's Labyrinth. So I think Guillermo del Toro is someone that could absolutely pull that off. And another thing I want to see Guillermo del Toro pull off is just capture essentially the Gothic vibe, which is Frankenstein. Frankenstein itself is a central text to Gothic literature, and it just reads throughout the whole book like that. Just first off, the notion thematically of like the natural and the supernatural, and just the fact that there's such psychological depth to everything, but also just in terms of the vibes, like sort of like these dark, mysterious settings. I imagine a lot of the architecture to be almost like, like medieval, ornate and things like that, which again, I think based off of even just that little frame that Vanity Fair posted, I think that was super promising. It's giving Gothic vibes heavily. So again, and just from what I've seen of Guillermo del Toro, I think this is a space that he really thrives in. So, and again, I'm hopeful because he said that Frankenstein, especially being the epitome of like, Gothic literature, is a project that it seems like it is like, the main passion project that he wants to do. So again, very excited to see what comes from that. But I also think another thing, which is going to be much harder, right, to pull off because I think he can do the Gothic vibe. I think the nature elements and everything like that. But what's going to be key and very difficult, this is, I think, if a Frankenstein movie is to fail, where it would happen, is the depiction of the daemon, the monster himself, because it's supposed to be just this absolutely horrifically grotesque, uncanny, loathsome depiction to the point, and that is absolutely central to the story, because without getting into spoilers, there are some times where the Frankenstein's daemon is actually very benevolent throughout this whole thing. He's sort of built in a way that has compassion in him. But the thing is, throughout the book, the daemon creation, Frankenstein's creation, his benevolence and goodwill is constantly met with hatred and loathsome and violence. Like he's just constantly shit on, and it's essentially because he is so horrific. And I think that's going to be, like I said, the hardest part to pull off. Like I think my opinion is that Frankenstein the monster needs to be like horrific and uncanny at like a unconscious level. Like that shit needs to haunt your dreams. That's personally how I feel. That's personally how I feel about it. Especially, when you consider the fact that and then I'm going to talk about some scenes here that I also think need to get pulled off really well. But one of them, just an absolutely chilling scene to me, is when Frankenstein's daemon sees its reflection in the water and is just horrified and just like, no wonder everybody hates me. I am like disgusting, disfigured, right? Just absolute self-loathsome, self-hatred and loathsomeness towards himself. And also just capturing the despair of the daemon. Like it really is, so much of this book is just him living in this absolute mental hell, and no matter what the daemon tries to do, despite his best intentions and his best goodwill, he is constantly being shit on. And there's a real despair of life and despair of creation, like basically just woe is me. In many ways, he even likens himself to it. He's like the fallen angel in the sense that it's like, why was I created simply to fall and live in misery? And part of that comes from the fact that the daemon is actually extremely intelligent. Like this isn't something I was expecting when I read the book, but the daemon ultimately learns language and almost as scientific himself. He sort of experiments with fire and foraging food. He's a very intelligent and again compassionate being, and that's what's so fascinating. The inside of him is genuinely good, but it's his external features, especially when you consider the fact that like Frankenstein is literally made up of like the daemon is made up of Victor Frankenstein just basically digging up graves and taking like these patchwork of human parts, and it's very grotesque and misfigured and disproportionate. So all of that, again, so you have that contrast, and I think that's what's so fascinating thematically about Frankenstein. It's like, who's the real monster here? Because then you have Victor Frankenstein, who from the very beginning shuns his creation, even though, right, this is the creation of life for Frankenstein was like his dream and his sole purpose for years. But when Victor Frankenstein actually, brings to life his creation, which is supposed to be a proud moment, he's supposed to be the benevolent creator, almost like a god, which again comes back to that whole conflict like with nature. But here's his creation, but the instant it actually happens, he said he's filled with breathless horror and disgust. So And then Victor Frankenstein too, I think for this to be successful, he undergoes, both of them are very similar and they're having these parallel tracks. But one thing that needs to happen, I think, for a successful Frankenstein is that Frankenstein himself needs to become a broken man by the end of the film. He is also just, again, in this parallel way, absolutely filled with agony and despair because his creation essentially leads to end up doing some very bad things, which weighs very heavily on Frankenstein. And that is really, so much of what is great about this book is watching really both of them, their character development and what ultimately ends in tragedy and despair for both of them. And so on top of all of this, right, so I think that stuff's going to be harder to kind of pull off, but just in general, there are some key scenes in this book that I think need to be featured in the movie, and the success of it, I think, will depend on how well they pull these scenes off. But I think one of the first scenes, which I'm really interested to see how Guillermo pulls this off, is Frankenstein actually coming to life, because when that happens, it's a truly sort of horrific and like terrifying scene. And so I won't get into the specifics, but as you can just imagine, right, that's a famous scene, like, it's alive, right? I think that's Frankenstein. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But he needs to be this grotesque, horrible creation. But like the actual moment in which life enters is a profound moment philosophically, just in general, but in the book. So I want to see, there's so much potential for that to be great. Another scene, which I already kind of mentioned, is when Frankenstein's daemon sees itself in the reflection and is filled with horror and disgust and self-loathing. Like, that's to me, especially when you read it in the book, it's just such an absolutely tragic scene to see this daemon who never asked to be born, never asked to be created, and who really entered the world with nothing but goodwill, just find himself filled with so much self-loathing. And, just the idea of this creature looking almost like, the mirror, the whole like self-reflection, the moment of consciousness, like, seeing oneself in the mirror for the first time. I just think that scene has potential to be super powerful and fantastic. And so there's another couple things that come to mind. This is like, I don't know if this counts as spoilers, but there's a part where Frankenstein eventually sort of takes refuge in this cottage, and he essentially starts like not spying on the family, but just watching the family and like deriving great joy from it, like listening to them talk and listening to the music and just like listening to them tell stories and stuff. Like, this is actually where he learns language. And there's again, beautiful scenes where Frankenstein's daemon is like, looking through a little nick in the piece of wood and just wanting to be loved and wanting love so bad and just living vicariously through this family. So just that whole image of him just like pitiful, almost just looking through this little crack and just getting so much delight from watching this family. Eventually, he ends up, because he's so benevolent and compassionate and he loves this family so much, who he's never interacted with except watching them, he does this thing where it's like he will do basically labor for them at night. Like, he won't sleep at night literally so he can cut them firewood or do chores for them. And when he hears them talk about it, it's like, whoa, what happened? I don't know. It's a good spirit, right? There's something benevolent out there. Like, someone's looking down upon us and giving us fortune, right? That's how they're talking about it. But then, and again, minor spoiler alert, there is this reveal that happens where the diamond finally works up the courage to approach the family. And so the first part is he goes up to a blind man and they start talking and they really hit it off and they're having like this really deep conversation. And Frankenstein's daemon is talking about how he has no friends and the person, but he's hideous to behold and this, that, and the other. And then the old blind man is like, talking with him and he's like, have faith, right? It doesn't matter how you look on the outside, this, that, and the other. And then the family comes home and they see Frankenstein's daemon and they basically just start beating the shit out of it. This daemon who could just crush them because he has superhuman powers and has been helping them toiling. Sorry, I'm kind of going off, but like, that scene is so powerful to me where he basically just gets run out of the cottage, even though he had just been doting on them and loving them so much. So I think that's a scene that, again, that whole sequence could, has potential to be really powerful. And then I also think, and this one I'm not going to get into because this is full spoiler, so I'm not going to mention this, but the ending scenes of the book, I think, are some of the most powerful and tragic, and I would just, I'm really curious to see what Guillermo Del Toro does with that. So again, I'm very interested to see what this movie looks like. I really enjoyed Frankenstein as a book. I also think it is just a book that lends itself to being adapted on film, whereas like a lot of books otherwise can't. I think this one really could be done well, but there are, as I've mentioned, a lot of things that are going to be tricky to pull off. But I think from what I've gathered, Guillermo Del Toro is a really great director. He seems passionate about this book and this project, and so I'm hopeful. So Let me know if there's any Guillermo Del Toro movies I should watch in preparation. Let me know what you thought of Frankenstein. Also, your concerns about this being adapted as a movie. In the meantime, follow your boy Big Nate at Big Nate's Book Reviews on Instagram. Smash that subscribe. And thank you for watching the Big Nate Review.